Hello, and welcome back to another Education is Possible, the podcast where we discuss the different avenues of education and challenge some of the preconceived notions of what education looks like and how it can be explored. Joining us today are the two hosts of one of my favorite podcasts, Pop and Play, Haeny Yoon and Nathan Holbert. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And it's nice to meet another Poppernaut.
Is that what the fans are called?
That's what we've
Yes,
called them
or that's what Nathan is trying to do. He's trying to make fetch happen.
any day now.
Nathan, I'm gonna step back, but Nathan, has anybody agreed to be called that?
I don't think so.
In his mind.
No, I have called the university president to his face. So it's like, oh, it's nice to know you're a Poppernaut. He's like, yeah, I guess.
Yeah. So our president, Tom Bailey, is a Poppernaut. He's not only the president of Teachers College, but the president of our fan club.
President of the fan club.
I will wear this title with distinction. Welcome to the podcast, and again, you both host the Pop and Play, but for anyone not aware, right, just introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about the podcast.
Hi, I'm Haeny Yoon. I'm an associate professor of early childhood and curriculum and teaching. I also direct and work on some projects around play initiatives at the Digital Futures Institute. And I think, we're excited to be on this podcast and with this topic because what we're trying to do is make play sort of this critical practice in teaching and research and just like our everyday encounters at work.
Yeah. And I'm Nathan Holbert. I'm also an associate professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, in the Technology, Media, and Learning program. My work's centered mostly around sort of designing play spaces and studying the ways in which the design of those playful environments can engage people in thinking about interesting topics or engage them in building practices or identity or agency towards, designing or creating things that can better their communities. I can say, a bit about the podcast. So Pop and Play came about, we're on season 6, so I guess it came about six or 7 years ago. And as Haney kind of noted, we were trying to think about ways in which we can kind of start building conversations about the possibilities of play, the ways in which different kinds of materials and objects and media can become playful and part of how we think about, youth and adult well-being and learning and all the different things that all entails. So we created a podcast to start having those conversations with each other and to have conversations with other scholars and artists and activists and creators out in the world. Each season we've kind of usually have tackled a different theme, but for the most part, episodes are on a topic that we find fun. We did a series on role playing. We've done episodes on research as play. We've done episodes on media representation, episodes on sort of children's media production, all over the place. We did an episode on skateboarding. So that's essentially what Pop and Play is. And yeah, you should check it out if you haven't heard it. Smash that subscribe button, as they say.
You can become your own Pop or not.
That's right.
Join us in space here. Um, that's great. I was introduced to the podcast when I was in Corson's class. Just seeing like have like education asked, and I saw one of its play, and Corson recommended the podcast, and I've been listening to it the past few months, and I've
Great.
thoroughly enjoyed on a lot of the topics um that were discussed. I think right now I'm on a fandom episode where
Mm.
like right how do people interact with fandoms, right, and shape like politics and stuff.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, good old Henry and Joanna.
Yep. Yep. It's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I, in seeing how much play really can intersect a lot of different areas, it got me thinking, right? Because our podcast is not dealing with education, right? What does play look like in education, right? Inside schools and, even
Hmm.
outside of that. Because education can happen anywhere, right? But,
Hmm.
we're traditionally seen as school, right? So I was wondering if, right, how does it look like inside of schools and outside of schools anywhere?
Hmm. Yeah. big, good question. I can start us off. I just think, like Nathan was saying, what we try to do with our podcast and what I think all of us are trying to do with conversations around play is just sort of make it visible how it manifests, and it manifests so differently, right? Whether it's in school or out of school, whether it's children, whether it's adults. I feel like there's all kinds of different ways that we might manifest and make visible play. And it's such a big way of just encountering the world, right? I think back to this season, and one of the things that we're trying to do this season is to be like, we have so many different identities that we're playing. And sometimes we kind of put ourselves and put other people in this box, like this person. Jordan Corson is a professor, so he must only like to do these things like write articles and teach his class, right? Or so and so is 5 years old, so all they must like to do is repetitive play or something like that. And so just beyond that,
Okay.
like what are the scope of people's identities, and almost like give permission for people to sort of do that. So what does play look like inside school? Nathan, I think you should tackle that.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it is a big question, right? So, on the one hand, I think, most people will recognize that sometimes school or structured learning spaces, whether they're schools or not, are not very playful. One thing that I know of, Haney in particular, his work has been really strongly about the ways in which play can be not an add-on, but play itself is a powerful mode of learning and engaging with the world and building meaning of the world. And a lot of my work has been around the ways in which we can build technologies, we can build experiences, we can build activities, we can build tools that communicate that these are things to be played with and things to explore and things to tinker with. I think play in schools can and play in learning spaces can look a lot of ways. But one thing that I think Haney and I have taken pretty seriously in how we talk about play and how we even also in our research of play is not thinking of learning and play as two separate things, and not even thinking of, though I think this is true, but not positioning play as somehow or another a way to get to learning. But play has value in and of itself, right? And learning can be part of the value that play brings, but also it just has value because we're humans and play is meaningful, it's important, it's part of how we connect with one another, it's part of how we connect with things and objects and ideas in the world. So I think that's been kind of a lot about how we think about, or why we think about play as being a topic worth talking about, and why it's a topic worth researching too.
I was thinking about, so I feel like there's always this tension between young people already kind of know how to play, they're already making these spaces for themselves, and they're already creating sets of practices, whether it's in school and out of school. And I think a lot of my work has been trying to surface that. Like sometimes we don't listen enough, sometimes we don't
Right.
actually look to see where play is happening. Sometimes we tell kids not to play, but they're just playing all the time, right? And so it's almost trying to surface some of those things that are happening. And I think the question that I get asked always as a follow-up then is, well, what's the purpose of a teacher then? Right? Like if kids are already doing this stuff and our job is to observe and surface that, then why are we even learning how to be a teacher? And so I think going back to Nathan's original point about like design and how we design the conditions of classrooms, I think there is a role, definitely a role that teachers play in it. And Nathan knows this because I've been like really obsessed with cookbooks lately. And not just the recipes, but the things that people write about
Yeah.
cooking. And it relates so much to play. And I came across this, I don't know how to say her name. It's Kate Lebo, I don't know. She's a poet and she's also a pie maker. And she like has this part in her book where she talks about rituals that promise transformation. And so what her and a lot of chefs will say is that, you hear that term like we never use recipes or whatever, and you're just like annoyed by it because you're like, well, for those people that are trying to cook, like we need a recipe, right, as a starting place. And I almost think that about learning
Mm,
and teaching, right, is that lesson plans, curriculum, all of that is necessary, right, because they form rituals and routines and like guidance and activity. And I think all these like really good cookbook people will say that the whole point of it is to now step out of the recipe and sort of make it your own, but you almost need that recipe as a guide to actually like fully immerse yourself in that play. So I do feel like that is what teachers can do, right? That's like the possibility and potential of being an educator in classrooms is that you can actually provide kids like quote unquote recipes or design activities to think about, to be thoughtful about your goals, right? Create conditions for some of that to happen. And then the whole point of it then is not to contain young people, right? The whole point of it then is to encourage them now to use that as a way to facilitate expansions, right, of what that is.
I like that. That's a fun metaphor. Teaching
Mm,
as recipes.
recipes.
As a home cook, I really love that.
Oh, home
Um,
cooking. It's awesome.
I think there is a lot of criticism in regards to schools and the way it's taught as being too rigid, but I do like conceptualizing it as recipes. It's a baseline to explore elsewhere. As when I
Yeah.
was in school, I really enjoyed my creative writing class because I always liked writing. But before I took that class, my stories really, like, if you read them, you're like, well, okay, this makes, I see what you're doing, but there's no direction. Whereas when I
Yeah.
actually had those tools, I could actually cook up something better. It does make me wonder, it is important, schools and teachers can offer these recipes for students to help them play after, but not does every student really get that recipe, right? Not every student is always going to appreciate some of the rituals in school. And
Hmm.
I wonder if that not every school really takes action on that. How do you feel about those kids that don't really accept or can't or the way the recipes are communicated to them?
Hmm.
Should there be a change in how that happens, which is very hard, right? Institutions are difficult
Hmm.
to change.
I think that's like the main critique of school, right? Is that like, sorry to make this cooking show about recipes now, but I think that's the critique of school is that so much of our curriculum is designed for everybody to enter in the same exact way, right? And
Right.
that there are plenty of children and plenty of young people in K through 12 schools that are not going to enter a certain experience kind of in the same way. And I think, and I always think about like, hopefully in time, maybe like a few years after I practice doing all these recipes, like I won't want them. I won't want this curriculum that is given to me in a book. I maybe want to experiment and want to try different things. Like I've witnessed a lot of children where they don't need me to instruct them on the Star Wars universe, right? They don't need me to instruct them on different aspects of mathematics or, things like that. Is that there is like an interest and intrigue that comes from that they already bring into a classroom and maybe the set of skills and tools that they need are very different than somebody else, right? But I also think that they might need other things as well, right? So I feel like there is this, I don't know, like I feel like the whole curriculum can be so constraining, but curriculum can also be expansive and curriculum can also be something that's co-constructed, right, with young people and with you as a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, and maybe that's the flaw of the recipe metaphor that kind of
Mm,
invites this standardization way of thinking about what we do, and certainly our best teachers are so capable of taking something that might come standard initially and then finding ways to kind of bring it into a space, making it student centered, making it learner centered so that there's a lot of agency there. And this is a thing I talk a lot about in my own work where I take kind of this constructionist design philosophy, which is like about building things that then learners can then take and build with. And having a truly learner-centered approach to education is scary. It takes a ton of work on the part of the educators as well as on the part of the students, but it opens up a wide space of possibilities of what can be explored, how it can be explored. And as a side note to that, a thing that often will happen in my classes, we'll be talking about these things, we'll introduce all these examples of this student-centered kinds of curriculum or kinds of projects or those types of things, and students will read them and they'll say, wow, this is incredible. This like really sounds transformative. It sounds like exactly how we should be thinking about education. But man, it also sounds really hard and it sounds really time consuming. And I just don't think it's very feasible. And every time I hear that, my first response is, get over it. Yeah, it is hard. It is time consuming. But it's absolutely worth it. What are we doing if we can recognize that there's like this meaningful kinds of education that's possible, that's out there, that's student centered, and instead we're saying like, yeah, but I'm going to give you the bad version because it sounds too hard to give you the good version. Like, what are we doing, right? So yes, I mean, it is difficult, and yes, like it does require the fact that we need to recognize that not all kids are the same, not all kids have the same interests, not all kids have the same goals, not all kids have the same way of looking at the world, but that we can build curriculum, we can build tools, we can build lessons, we can build educational environments to be student centered so that those different kids can approach it, can explore it together in different ways. That's another thing. They do this as a community. That's super possible. And it happens in all sorts of places all the time, right? But it is hard.
Bosco, do you mind if I jump in with a quick question? Because I'm always wondering about how we try to push the boundaries really far. And I wonder if the two of you would entertain the idea that maybe there don't need to be conditions to play, that you can essentially, I was thinking for us older folks, I think of play like Calvin Ball, that essentially
The rules
there's,
can change at any time.
yeah,
Yeah.
the rules are, they're always emergent, right? Like, how do you write a recipe for a game that has no rules, or the rules are whatever
Mhm.
um, the players decide in that moment? Or do you think that that just invites chaos, particularly in a formalized space like a classroom?
I'm going to let Haeny take a stab at this. I tend to think creating too many boundaries, I think, can be problematic. But maybe before I pass it off, I will say that I think constraints can be incredibly empowering and generative. Literally in our class on Monday, we talked about constraints and affordances and how you can design objects or experiences or systems that can communicate what they're for or what you can do with them, and also what kinds of uses or activities or explorations are going to be less productive and less meaningful, right? And so I do think constraints can be useful for a starting point to say, like, let's play in this area here, right? Like, let's start imagining this type of activity, or let's role play in this way, or whatever. But the key is that you use those strains as a starting point to be generative, and then they get out of the way, right? If a kid starts and they're role playing in this one way, but they want to go over here, then let them go over there, right? But sort of saying like, do anything you want, imagine anything you can imagine, create anything you want to create, can actually be really dispowering, right? It's too much. So constraints can be good as a starting point. They can be good for generating ideas. Then I think the best kinds of learner centered environments are those that can quickly open up past those constraints when required to.
Yeah, I'm gonna go the non-practical route and go the emotional feeling route. I've been reflecting on the notion of boundaries and how sometimes boundaries are actually provide a real safety for people. And then sometimes boundaries can be very stifling for people, right? So it's not like an either or kind of thing, but I do feel like they kind of provide different sorts of I don't know if we want to call that a condition or something, but I often think about how like boundaries will lead to exclusions, right, in play,
Mhm.
but boundaries can also lead to inclusion, right? And I think about this great book that Vivian Paley wrote about kindergartners, and they made up this rule that says you can't say you can't play, right? And it came from like all of these different tensions and conflicts and things that were happening, right? And so it's like they almost set their own rules and boundaries for how inclusion and acceptance and all of that was going to happen. So I just think about how I don't feel like it has to be one thing, because I think for some young people, like having boundaries, having rules is like a safe space, right? And they really needed to have to experience play in its fullness, to have this like affect, right, that they're kind of engaging with and going through and play. But then boundaries at the same time can really be stifling. And the same set of boundaries, right, for two different people can be so stifling, it can actually be oppressive and like not meaningful for them to engage in that, right? So it's just becomes this complicated matter of like, how do we, I don't want to dismiss that by saying like, no, rules, boundaries, bad, right? But that there are different things that people get out of those conditions.
I think in hearing this out, it almost was like going back to the recipes.
Love to hear it.
If school wasn't graded, right?
Uh-huh.
If there wasn't that pressure to get A's, I think that would actually make school a better place because then you are getting the recipe, right? But it's not as pressured on you to say like this is exactly what it has to be, right? You're just there to learn. So there is a boundary or a baseline knowledge which can create boundaries. And an episode I really liked, which I think kind of exemplifies the where maybe boundaries should be a little more laxed, but not entirely, was the Halloween episode from last year where you were talking about like the scary topics that children might get into, quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And right, how right, it's a little concerning sometimes for adults to hear, oh no, what are they talking about? Freddy Krueger, that's scary. But I think in your episode they were talking about I think it was Michael Myers and
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
how he
Yep.
was the killer, but they were more scared because somebody said actually he's in that school. He's like, my
The high
sister's in
He's
school.
that
at the high
school.
school. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
were more scared of that and they tried to figure out like
Mhm.
how are we gonna stop them? But I think in that, right, that they're working on the baseline, right? They have the
Mhm.
recipe in mind, but they're right. We don't know how they're going to build off it. But I feel like
Mhm.
I think that's just something we kind of have to grapple with. And there were some hard lines that I remember you guys were saying, like if they're starting to talk about discrimination or if they start having discriminatory thoughts, that's maybe where an adult should step in and say,
Mhm.
Probably not the best, right? Or not necessarily
Mhm.
completely shutting them down, chastising them, but just guiding them in the better direction,
Mhm.
right? Kind of serving more as a steward for them, but letting them um, kind of go in
Yeah.
their own direction.
Yeah, I think you said like two really important points. And one is I feel like when we look at play that kind of makes us uncomfortable, it makes us uncomfortable because we're bringing sort of our perspective right onto that. So we're like, oh, they're playing this, so that must mean they mean this. Because usually
Right.
when we do it, that's what we mean, right? But that their intention, like you said, even with Michael Myers coming to the high school, their intention for that play is actually different from the one that I bring into that experience, right? And so I think that's really important. And I think I want to go back to the grading thing because I think you're right. Because I feel like when I think about outside of school, the reason why we can play with a little bit more freedom and flexibility and greater risk outside of school is because there is this no one's grading you on it and there's room then to experiment, right? And I feel like there isn't that pressure of what the productivity machine is in school makes it really hard to do that because even when they say, oh, just try experiment, like you know that there's a grade or a product at the end that you have to do, right? And that experimentation also feels a little disingenuous where as like if
Right.
I was experimenting with something that I don't have no idea how to do, if it sucks, nobody's telling me it sucks except like people around me, like Nathan might be like, that's ugly. Right? But yeah.
To poke at the grading a little bit, I do think I'm 100% in agreement. I do think there are ways, other models of assessment that we can use that are productive for learners and for teachers and for educators. I think the purpose of assessment is to provide some sense of feedback of progress that you're making, both to you, so you know you're learning, you know you're making progress, and to the teacher, so that they have a sense of like where you're at and what you could use some help on. We don't do grades like that in most schools. Most grades are, these sort of summative things. They're ranking you and they're deciding whether you're good or bad, but they're not used like when you finish a test, how often do you have a chance to come back and improve on that test? Like, no, it's done. You took it, you got the grade, it's over now, which is totally defeats the point in some ways. So there are assessment models, there's formative assessment models, there's others. My son goes to a school right now that has a system where they basically do kind of small activities that start to kind of accumulate for something like a grade, but then they have these like larger, like, okay, now you can go make an attempt at a larger project or a larger artifact, and then you get feedback on it and you have a chance to revise it. And so in the end, what your grade is it's actually a representation of this long journey of building something that I feel like, pretty accurately represents what he's done over the past, few weeks or whatever. So I think there are ways in which grades themselves can be useful. But yeah, I totally agree. Like they become, in the way they're usually deployed in schools, they just become a way to rank and demoralize kids. And I don't want anything to do with that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, when I hear you talk, maybe it's like we have to disentangle assessment and feedback with grading and evaluation,
Yeah,
and not
yeah,
make them necessarily synonymous.
yeah.
I think kind of leaving the institution of school for a bit and focusing on play outside because right there is that greater area for exploration, right? Like when you hang out with friends, I think the only grading is just maybe some little bit of judgment. But if you
Hmm.
have a really good friendship, okay, I get it, right? That was maybe a little crass, a little not well thought out, but you're not fully discouraged. Where I feel like seeing like an F on your report card is just like more crushing, right? Because then it's like, oh no, what am I gonna do? Where's my future, right? What my parents would think. Where your friend is like, all right, bro, like let me try again. All right? I'll see you. Um, but it does make me think like it's very hard. There are certainly avenues we can explore in school, but it's very hard to change the institutions. So what possibilities can we have outside, right? What does play make possible outside, and what are some of the challenges, right? Like I've been hearing a lot about like the lack of third spaces, right? There's
Hmm.
very little spaces you can just go hang out with or hang out in, right? Like malls are closing.
Hmm.
There's I mean I have like one comic shop near me
Mm.
and nothing else. I can't hang out anywhere where I live.
Mhm.
This may date us a little bit, but there was an event that happened, was it yesterday or the day before? There was a big snowball fight in Washington Square Park. And it was an organized, planned event where a bunch of college kids came out and just had this massive, joyful, delightful snowball battle. And then the police showed up and tried to kind of
Mm.
stop it and shut it down. I mean, like, this is a really nice example of like where there's just this sense that there is no safe place to be joyful. There is no safe place to play. There is no safe place to just mess about. This is especially true for younger people. Teens in particular, I think really do struggle to have places where they can just sort of be teens. And, sometimes teens can behave in ways that maybe is a little antisocial, but like they still need space to do that. They still need opportunities to sort of find those things out. So I think that's a real problem. That's a real challenge. And it's kind of not to again like come back to the beginning, but like it's kind of part of why we started the podcast in some ways was to start kind of elevating the conversation to identify those things as real, to identify this as a need, and to start thinking about ways in which we can kind of collectively as a society value play a little bit more. We did an initiative a few years ago where we invited a bunch of game designers, technologists, media creators, educators together to come to teach TC to start thinking about possible play experiences. We then did some small scale kind of design experiences out in like public play spaces. We also, the class that we're teaching together, the final project on this is to have students in our class go and create a public play experience for people out in Central Park. I think there's like a massive opportunity for us as just people in society, in wherever we are, to find opportunities to do that, to create space for play. And that can happen, like I said, like our class, like out in Central Park, but it can also happen in your institution. So
Mm.
one of our first episodes, we interviewed John Jackson, and he talked about that, like about trying to make that space of work for his students and for his colleagues and for other faculty members a space that felt playful, a space that felt like it could have some experimentation and exploration, right? Like there's all sorts of ways that we, wherever we are at, can start creating space for that, but it has to be a conscious effort because our society in America is not structured to value that in any way.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like you hit it on the nose. I feel like the one solution or one thing that I could think of is just the space, because I do think so much of play gets facilitated and expanded and mobilized through community, right? Like if I'm a Star Wars fan, which I am by default, but not really. Because I've seen communities where people are Star Wars fans, and I'm like, oh yeah,
You're like, oh,
I'm not
that's a
that.
fan.
Yeah, that is a bridge too far for me, right? But I think about like how much of their play expands because they're in community with
Right.
each other, and that community can be built by outside external forces, right? Whether it's institutions or classrooms or schools or things like that. But that community can also be just formed, right, by the members of that play, right? So I'm almost thinking like community can be these physical spaces where play can happen, but that community can also be these like figurative, metaphorical spaces, right, where people kind of get together around a similar pursuit. So I do think there's like so much value in how that community space sort of develops. And maybe that happens in and out of our institutions. And maybe I think it just happens more out of institutions because the people who play, like the players, can actually mobilize that community.
I think the lack of space is especially pertinent to like younger people, like you said, my generation to Gen Z, right? Um, where like I keep seeing articles, oh, loneliness crisis, there's a friendship shortage,
Mhm.
and I feel lucky to have friends. I don't really see them that often, but we like Discord can become a space,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
Mhm.
we
Yep.
talk and we can actually plan things out, like going to Comic-Con, right? Comic-Con is not
Mhm.
accessible to everyone. It should be more accessible. I feel like there should be
Mm.
more, but going there, it is nice to be able to come together and see so many people in a place that, great, it's a big crowd, and you'd think somebody with social anxiety would be like really scared. Like I thought I would be terrified,
Mm.
but I just looked around. I'm like, they're dressed like the Commander Cody. That's Obi. Oh
My
my!
people.
Everyone's here, and
Yeah.
it's a nicer experience than I feel like, yeah, the limitations of a classroom can't, you can, there's not that much room for like clubs or to really can get that, mainly just because I think expectations, like, oh, you have to have a sports team, a debate club, right? Where someone's like, could
Mhm.
we have like a little like Star Wars club? I don't know, right? It's like
Yeah.
Oh
that's not
yeah.
really within the realms of schools, but like
Yeah.
outside, it is
Sure.
easier.
It should be. Why not?
It should
Yeah.
Right?
be,
Why not?
yeah.
I mean, okay, quick story. Last week, I forced my colleague and friend Joanna to come to a Traders watch party with me at a bar in Harlem. Okay, and I think part of it is I walked in at like 9. We didn't get in because they had a special guest and it was one of the contestants of the show, and we're like freaking out, right? But I think one of the reason why I got drawn to that is that I don't know these people, right? I have never met them. I don't know what the expectation is going to be. I don't know what's going to happen in that space, but I just know that we're all obsessed with a similar thing. And the idea of just being together and being able to like play in that space is really exciting, right? And I think about like what you said, Bosco, about how different sorts of things will bring different people together. Like there is a clever community for everyone, right? Just as long as people can mobilize together
Yeah.
around it.
Yeah, community has become sort of an unofficial theme of our podcast. It's like pop, play, and community, right? Like it seems like every topic we get into, every conversation we start kind of exploring. It's like, oh, it's about community. That's what it's about at the other end.
Mhm, mhm,
Yeah. There's been a lot of talk, and I've really subscribed to the idea of like we need to bring back the village, right?
mm,
Because I think we're too
mhm.
focused on the individual, like go out there, leave this house, go live
Yeah.
in another house
Uh,
alone,
yeah.
right? Don't really talk to us, and that's isolating. And I think now with my generation being so depressed,
Mhm,
we are very
mhm,
depressed. There
mhm.
has been more out or more of a want to go out and like play, right? Because the other
Yeah.
alternative is accepting our complete indentured servitude to a system that's going to always oppress us, right? We're not going to be that. And I think, right, kind of focusing on some of the possibilities that play does, at least for me personally, my with being with my friends, I have learned more about like positive masculinity around them than
Mm,
I ever
Hmm.
did in school, right? School is too clicky, but with my friends, right, we're very vulnerable around each other. And
mm.
sometimes it's hard to get us through, but at the end of the day, it's like, you haven't talked to me in 2 days. What is up? I want to talk to you. Let's play a game.
Yeah,
And that engenders a conversation of, wow, we both learned something here today.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
And I
great.
think, yeah, I just want to know like what other kind of do you see those moments happening in outside, or like what other moments do you see
Yeah.
the specifics of like outside play does to like
Yeah.
what lessons learned?
I mean, I love that example that you gave because I think there is possibility in community and conversation to interrupt maybe some dominant paradigm that we might have about gender, about age, about race, about these distinctions that make us uniquely human, right? And so I think there are ways to do that. And I feel like those interruptions actually happen inside of school too, right? And when young people play, there are so many uncomfortable moments that happen in the confluence of gender and race and class and ethnicity and language that also get manifested in play too. So I think that we always say play is not always innocent, right? Play can also be dangerous and risky and can bring up a lot of problematic things. But I feel like that's like the whole point of having a functional society is that we're able to have conversations around problematic things and that we're not always trying to dissuade or tamp down on the things that could potentially lead to problematic conversations or instances, right? That we are opening possibilities for that up, and then that gives us kind of a starting point to begin. So I think that's like the affordance of being in those spaces is that it's not always going to be like how many times have we been in a play space where like that person's annoying, I hate what that person said, I really don't want to be around them. I feel like those are all negotiations that we all have to
Yeah.
sort of go through and live with.
Any opportunity for community can do that. I think play creates also a bit of a, it gets talked about in different ways. It kind of creates a magic circle. It kind of creates permission structure that creates, sometimes it lowers the stakes. It has a way of, in various media and various kinds of play, just creating the conditions to have those conversations, like you just mentioned, Bosco. It creates a space for you to try things out that you might be a little uncomfortable trying out if the stakes were a little higher. The playful nature of it also kind of lowers the barrier of seriousness. Like you can go to Comic-Con and you can dress as like a crazy wild character that you wouldn't normally do in other settings, but now because it's kind of a part of a playful experience, it gives you space to try that out and see what that feels like. There's mountains and mountains and mountains of research on this and from lots of different angles about the way in which kind of play creates space for this type of work.
Mm. Have you guys ever read that? I know I've shared this with Nathan, but there is a New York Times article from like a few years ago about Neopets and like that generation of people that were in this like small window of being in like Neopets communities and so it was like all these people kind of reflecting on their Neopets and their I don't even know what it's called, right? It's like outside of my generational whatever, but just that this idea that you can be somebody else, you can try new identities, you might be this shy, quiet person at school, but then you come into your Neopets realm or whatever they called it, your Neopets kingdom or something, and you can do all of these things that you didn't do at school, right? So you could try out these like different possibilities, and that's you, and that's also you, right? Like I
Yeah.
think about that
Yeah.
great article that John Wargo wrote about how every selfie tells a story, right? And that there's like young people talked about their online identities not as like distinct from their quote unquote real
Right.
identities, but they were
Right.
talking about these were all real, right? These are all parts of me that I can kind of manifest here in this online space because it's like this, but at school I'm going to be this person because these are the conditions and parameters. It doesn't mean that neither of them is more them than the other, right? That there's ways that they're kind of building this identity in those spaces. So I think they're like critical.
Yep.
I wonder if I can jump in and,
Mhm.
as a professional killjoy, sort of my sort of role. It it seems like you all are. I mean, you're running a podcast called Pop and Play. Clearly, you're a fan of. You're both writing about, thinking about doing play, teaching play. But is there a? I mean, I'm wondering about back to Nathan's idea of. There's this big joyous snowball fight and the cops show up. And I'm wondering about the politics of play, but I'm also
Mhm.
wondering about just kind of the mundane. I remember many times playing and ending up in tears. I remember
Mhm.
playing and being really angry. I was never a take my ball and go home kid, but I was a
Yeah. Yeah.
you were cheating somehow in Nintendo 64. I'm really angry and you know, like play often didn't go great, and also there's this big question of who gets to play in what ways.
Mhm.
So I don't know, do you see any downsides, any drawbacks? What are the politics of play? What are the limitations of play?
Yeah, we have an episode with Aaron Tremmell from I think it was our last season, previous season, that tries to kind of explore this topic a little more deeply. And he kind of alluded to it a little bit too with Bosco with your question about the Halloween episode. Like there are ways in which play has many different forms, and sometimes play can be incredibly empowering and generative and joyful, and sometimes it can be painful and exclusionary and problematic. And to Haney's point about the sort of Michael Myers story, that we don't always, as on the outside as educators or as adults or whatever, if we're observing young people playing, we can't always know whether certain boundaries or lines have been crossed, or whether these are spaces that things are being productively worked through and out, right? And so there's kind of like a tension here. On the one hand, it is absolutely play can be dark. Play can be not meaningful. Play can be dangerous. Aaron, who I mentioned in the previous episode, he has a way of talking. He has a book called Repairing Play. I was gonna forget the name for a minute there, and he talks about the ways in which sometimes, using examples of like torture, for example, sometimes something can be play for one person, but it can be torture for somebody else. People can be being used as objects and their humanity stripped away through certain kinds of acts of play. All of that, though, is part of play. It doesn't mean it's all good, and doesn't mean we should just always be celebrating without any criticality to those things. But we have to recognize that play, like any other kind of human experience, has multitudes. It's complex. It's got ways in which it is both powerful and painful, meaningful and mundane, just to keep the alliteration going. Uh, but you kind of, the part of the reason it's good and part of the reason it has value is because it can be all of those things, right? And so recognizing that complexity, trying to think about that complexity, being aware of it, being kind of in tune with all of the kind of various directions that it can go in, but then also creating space where that can happen. I mean, just the last thought here is like the number of times where you have a play experience that ends in tears, like that's also productive, though. It doesn't feel good in the moment, but it's also part of socialization. It's part of kind of realizing how to communicate, how to interact, what boundaries are present. Classically in the literature, literally for decades, they talk about like animals play, right? And one of the kind of examples of animals play is when they bite each other. They play bite. Well, play bite can feel like a real bite if done improperly, right? And so part of what play is it's the possibility of that bite hurting as well as that bite being fun.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, Jordan, I'm glad you brought that up because I do feel like I don't want people to leave this podcast thinking that play is going to be this idealistic landscape that if we just play more, that our lives will be so much better and we fixed everything, right? Because I think what you are alluding to is that, there is like a racialized and gender component to play, right? That's so obvious when you look at, like, even if you as a teacher try to do everything you can to make sure that there are no racial conversations happening in your classroom, there are going to be. But then the one that we could always see that's so obvious in early childhood classroom is how gender plays out, right? Like the girls and
Yep.
boys, the gender hierarchies, the way, like, it's almost like a natural social instinct, right? That young children have to do that. And it's because, like, I don't believe as an early childhood person that children are like all wholly innocent, right? Because in that like distinction of children as innocent, then we dismiss them as cute, or we dismiss them as
Right.
not knowing, or we dismiss them as quote unquote just playing, pun intended, right? But that they actually do have agency and they have thoughts and they're processing these ideas and they're processing the ideas that are happening in the social landscape, right? And that's going to come out in the way that they play, right? And so play can be like so deeply problematic. It can offend people, right? It can challenge people. It can cause a lot of tension. It can be very violent too, right? If you think about like the way that play also becomes like this violent act as well. There's this Miguel Sicard, he wrote a book called Play Matters, and the whole first two chapters, he basically is talking about how play is not fun. Right? And that like there is like this dance between like it being a destructive thing and being a constructive
Mhm.
thing, right? Where it creates a lot of things and destroys a lot of things, right? That it's like can be very nihilistic, but then can be like really joyful and pleasurable and fun and stuff like that, right? So I feel like it would like we would be remiss not to talk about play. Like if we're going to talk about play and it's all in its whole entirety, right? We're not just talking about play as fun. We're trying to construct a much more complicated vision of what
Yeah.
play is.
Yeah, to that point, I do wonder about play in regards to people who are on the spectrum or who have ADHD, because sometimes it is hard to, right, you were saying play is torture, and I know for one of my friends, what is fun to the rest of the group, he cannot handle it. And
Hmm.
it's very hard for us to kind of understand sometimes, and it's hard for him to put it into words. So, you know, in these cases, I do wonder then, how do you approach that if you do want to play with someone, right? If you want to engage in play, how do you try and bridge that kind of gap to make sure that, you know, when you're playing with them, that it's not just what you want to play, right? It's what they want to play.
Hmm.
And right, it can
Hmm.
get uncomfortable and ugly, right? We've had conversations where he just got very mad at us saying that you guys don't understand, this is terrible for me, right? But we kind of moved past that. So I just want to know, like, what are some
Hmm.
ways of like navigating those like ugly spots of play?
Hmm. That's like a perfect segue to, I think, our previous conversation. Some of my research has been in classrooms with inclusive settings with children on the spectrum. And what I learned from those experiences is that their play is very different. And I think I go back to my earlier point that sometimes we think that fun and play and opportunities and conditions that we create are based on our own perspective, right? From where we sit. So, if I've been a teacher for a really long time, I'm not just using my perspective, but I'm also using my experiences and interactions with kids to be like, okay, I think most kids will think this condition is fun, or most kids will think this activity is good, right? And when we do that most kids thing, like we know that there's going to be some children and some young people that sit on the margins of that, right? And so I think like some of it has really been, I think there's been like a couple different things that have happened in my research projects is one, like I definitely had to do some things that I did not think were fun. Okay, like I spent a lot of time talking about like pride fighters and things that I didn't think was that fun, but was fun to the child that was
Yeah.
engaging in that. And that's part of negotiating play, right? You can't
Yeah.
always just play the thing that you want to play all the time, right? That there has to be some kind of negotiation with that. And I also think that that's where like tools and resources and ways to engage in play is so critical to young people who are trying to find a way in. We wouldn't be taking responsibility if we were like, no, we just love your interest and we're going to try to nurture it. And there will never come a time where someone's going to push back. There's never going to be a time when you ask someone if you could play and everybody's going to say yes, right? I think that's like not the way to run a functioning classroom, right? Is to say like, oh, so and so only likes to play this, and maybe he has some issues with this social processing part of it. So if everybody can just make sure that you say yes to him all the time, then that'd be great, right? That's not a social structure that happens outside of that classroom at that school. So I think that's where the tools sort of come in, and that's where you have to sort of take responsibility for that. Like I think about like that recent incident that happened at BAFTA, right? I forgot who it was that said he has Tourette syndrome. Like I
Yeah.
don't discredit that as an outgrowth of your disability. The part that I have an issue with is that you should take responsibility for that, acknowledge that, and apologize for doing harm on somebody else, right? And I think that there is like this tricky balance between like giving young people entryways to play in ways that also include like some of the, kids who have disabilities, whether it's physical, cognitive, social, emotional, whatever those things are, but then also at the same time provide tools for us to take responsibility to engage in play when it becomes tensions like that.
I concur.
Yeah, that was perfectly said, actually. Yeah. Final question. This is very important. Name your top three Star Wars medias. Movies, shows, short series, books. I want to know.
Oh,
Also, Bosco,
Yeah.
since you asked that, you don't get out of it. You're gonna have to share as well.
gonna have to
I will.
confess.
Oh my God, Nathan's like, here are my 800 things. Let me think.
I got three for you. These are in no particular order, but these are three things I love dearly, and I've mentioned these on most of them on the podcast. So the TV show Andor is absolutely fantastic, extremely relevant these days, and I think just kind of a brilliant piece of media that just happens to be Star Wars as well, right? And I love it. I'm also maybe basic perhaps, but Empire Strikes Back is the best of the films. And then for my curveball, the video game Knights of the Old Republic, which is quite old now, but it was a role-playing Star Wars game that came out in the early 2000s, I believe, like 2003 or 4 or something like that. Just an absolutely brilliant Star Wars story, lots of fun to play as well. So those are my top three.
Oh God, now I have to search for three in my mind that I didn't know about.
Haney's answer is the Galactic Star Cruiser in Disney World.
No, that is not on the top of my list. I mean, okay, I guess I'll say I actually survived the whole series of The Mandalorian. But maybe I mean, that's the one that Pedro
Survived.
Pascal,
High praise.
yeah, I mean, that's the one Pedro Pascal is in,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, mainly because he's in it.
Absolutely.
Because who's not in love with him? I survived. Maybe whenever Rogue One was out, that one, that movie,
Good.
because that coincided perfectly with my research. So I watched that very carefully so I could talk to the kid that was in that classroom that was really into it. So that's my second one. And I like stickers. So the Star
Star
Wars
Wars stickers.
stickers count as media.
I love it.
I have a lot of those too.
What about you, Bosco?
Okay. Hmm.
He's very excited about this question.
Star Wars Episode 3, I think, is my favorite movie, mainly
Mm.
because
Really?
that, I think, was actually the first movie I watched as a kid. I didn't know
Ah.
what it was. I just remember
Uh,
looking at it and being like, oh, this is cool.
uh,
What? Um,
Lightsabers? I am in. Yeah.
Clone Troopers. I love it all. Second thing I think is the game Star Wars Empire at War.
Mm.
I that combined two big interests of play for me. One, Star Wars,
uh,
but also military combat, right? These strategic things. My friends never liked these games, right? So I could never play with them. But for me, it's so fun to say, all right, we're gonna hold a defensive line here. We're gonna have backup here. If the line breaks at this point, I know I have Anakin in that line. He's fine. Third item, yeah, I feel like Andor. Andor is just so beautiful as a
So
series,
good.
mm,
and especially now, it's so needed. One way out,
Yeah.
one way out.
Got to get
yeah,
Haney to watch that sometime.
I know you've been talking about it for so long that I probably should to overthrow power and authority.
Yep. Pretty much.
That's the theme. That's our controversial statement of this podcast episode.
Yeah, season one, how do you become a rebel, and season two, how do you overthrow the fascists? It's all pretty relevant.
Can you say a little bit more? I'm not sure how that connects to anything today.
Nope, not saying anymore. I've said enough.
Fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine. I mean, Nathan and I are millennial white dudes. I think my only thing I would change is I might put Rogue One in, and it's not even a very good game. Maybe is it Shadow of Empire? Shadows of Empire? Just because I was an
Mhm.
N64 kid, I must have played that level on Hoth for like days on end. But yeah, Andor and Empire Strikes Back are easily interchangeable at the top.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's
And
great.
if we're going characters, literally just my love of kitsch and adorableness, Baby Yoda can do anything.
Perfect.
That's
I mean,
great.
other than trying to identify me as a millennial, you nailed it.
Yeah. We're
Yeah.
what white dudes
Um,
of a certain age and
me
nerdiness
and
and
Bosco
left
will
of.
stay in the Gen Z vibe.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was gonna make a joke about you being
Kidding.
Gen Z multiple times, but I
Yeah,
let it
just
go.
kidding. I like to joke about how I'm Gen Z. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
a cruel joke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, joke on you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Awesome.
All right.
Feeling good?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was so
I'm
fun.
really, yeah, I'm really glad we were able to make this work.
yeah.
I'm just a big fan of pop and play. Proud pop or not, I'm coming
Yeah.
Wednesday.
We
Yeah.
need some merch.
Yeah, thank you. You made it. You made our day.
Yeah, thanks, Bosco. That was a lot of fun. Appreciate you
Yeah.
having us.